Part of research dissemination or publication of one's research is not just writing about it and getting it put in a journal, but also talking about it at conferences. And one of the activities I've done to help support internationalization of research for international scholars is to also prepare them to give presentations about their research at conferences. And one of the recommendations I make to those researchers, and in fact I apply to my own presentations, is try to nail the introduction. Try to nail the first few seconds, even or the first minute of your presentation, because if you get that right, you set yourself on the right track. You cause a good first impression. That good first impression can boost your confidence as you continue speaking. And if everything else goes wrong, at least you've set yourself on the right path, and maybe that very first impression will take you far. And there are some parallels with that, with writing a research article, is that if you get nothing else right, try to at least get as good as you can get it, the introduction section, because obviously that's your greeting card, that's your business card, that's the thing, that's the first impression that the reader is going to get. And we're going to talk today in this video about how to make how to nail that good first impression by making your contribution clear. So in this video, I'm going to talk about the moves that good authors often make to make the novelty or the importance of their research stand out, especially in the introduction section. And we'll also talk about common rhetorical pitfall and why that matters. Okay, so in the last video, we looked at the beginning of the abstract of an article that I published, and how there was the they say and then the I say. First, talking about the research that already existed in that conversation that I was entering into about the non-native speakers needing to publish and so on, and publishing more and more. And then the I say, my contribution, which is little is known about the extent to which that trend may be affecting the way in which English is used in that genre. Okay, so John Swales, as we mentioned in the last video with the sort of cars model, creating a research space, he would call this first clause a kind of move one, and then the second one a move two. And then finally, in that second sentence, to address this gap where I talk about what I did in the research to address the second move, it would be called move three. So there's three moves here in this very, very short bit of text. John Swales would say there are three rhetorical moves. And in cars, therefore, John Swales would say that researchers in move one often do what he called establish a territory, which is basically when the authors talk about the conversation that they're entering, the importance of the research. And remember the vacuum cleaner metaphor, the vacuum cleaner anecdote, that the greater the problem, the more pressing the issue, the easier it will be to sell whatever it is, whatever position you're taking, whatever data, whatever problem you're aiming to solve through your research. That territory is key. So that's establishing the territory is often the first move that an author will make, establishing the importance of the topic, the conversation you're entering. And then move two is where you establish your niche or niche, depending on which side of the Atlantic your English is from. And that niche often includes a kind of gap. In other words, in that conversation, again, going back to that metaphor of the packed subway car, which gap are you entering? Where is your space? What is basically the justification for what you're talking about? Why is this important? And then the third move is occupying that niche or niche, which is basically saying how that gap will be or was filled by whatever approach that you took in your research to tackle that problem or that issue or whatever. So that's move one, move two, move three, establishing a territory, establishing a niche, and occupying that niche. So here you see it in practice, where there was talking about the importance or the conversation, the first one. Move two, that was the niche in my case, that there was little known about the fact that more non-native speakers are publishing the research, how it may be affecting English language, academic English itself. And then finally, what I did to look into that second question, that second move. Okay. Give another example, just another example, completely from a completely different field, different discipline altogether, that of experimental social psychology. So this is a paper called "The More You Play, the More Aggressive You Become: A Long-Term Experimental Study of Cumulative Violent Video Game Effects on Hostile Expectations and Aggressive Behavior." Right. So what the authors do here in the abstract, you can see in the very first sentence, they say, "It is well established that violent video games increase aggression." So clearly, that very first sentence here is establishing the territory. And then there's a stronger evidence of short-term video game effects than of long-term effects. So they're saying, okay, well, there's already in that train car, we've already got this, but there's a gap here about long-term effects. So that's them establishing territory and then establishing their niche. That there aren't enough papers, there isn't enough research about the long-term effects of aggression, potential aggression increase related to violent video games. And then, of course, the third move, the present experiment that they're presenting, then thus tests the effects, long-term effects. Very clear. And the effect on the reviewer when they look at this is very positive, because they see, okay, here's a conversation, here's the importance of this topic. This is the gap. There's still what we still need to know about that and why that's important. And then here's what they did. And that immediately orients the reader. And we'll be talking about orienting the reader more in next week's module. But this sets the reader on the right path, and it's very important. And perhaps more importantly, when the reviewer cannot see a number one or a number two, it can frustrate the reviewer. So those three things, they don't have to be present in your abstract, they don't have to be present in your introduction, and you'll find research that's published missing one of those, or both of those, or maybe even all of those. But in this course, we're looking at how can we increase a positive impression, the chances of your being published. And as we saw in Module 2, one of the more common complaints that reviewers have when they reject an article is not being able to identify the territory, not being able to identify the novelty or the contribution, and that happens especially with move number 2. And when they can't see move number 2, that's already setting, can weigh negatively on your paper. So here is a kind of adapted abstract from a real paper it's been changed to anonymize it, but it's something that I worked on myself. Can you find the conversation or move 1 in this? So let's look at it together. We carried out an exploratory study with the aim of analyzing what strategies nurses adopt when treating patients with alcohol-related dependencies, with the aim of identifying the extent which those strategies address the deeper issues involved. Through the study, we were able to identify a number of important facets of patient care that are impacted positively by nurses. Well, aside from a couple of grammatical and proofreading errors in this short abstract here, yeah, as you can see, it's difficult to identify um, what conversation they're entering. There's no clear move one. What I see here is more of a move three, really. Um, and so it's hard to, as I mentioned earlier, if one situates one's research within an important conversation that elevates the perceived importance of whatever the move two might be. Without that, without a move one, without talking about what conversation you wish to enter into, without a they say, it's they're less likely to want to understand or listen to what your I say is. So basically, this looks like just one big move three. This this they say and I say move is actually therefore a good pattern to remember, not just in the introduction, but as you'll see in the coming modules, uh, in other sections such as the discussion section as well. As you will have read before you even watched this video, Liana Renault, who was a researcher at Georgia State University, but originally began her research in Brazil. She conducted research to look into the question of whether Brazilians structure their discourse in a different way than the international journals do, or rather, I should say, whether the articles Brazilians submit to a Brazilian journal is structured in a way that's different from articles that are published in a non-Brazilian or a journal in a non-Brazilian context. And so what she found was that from the analysis of the introductions using Carr's model, that there was significant deviation to start with. 7 out of the 10 Brazilian introductions do not contain a move 2, i.e. they do not establish a niche. In other words, the majority of the introductions that she analyzed in a journal that was analogous to one that was published by a non-Brazilian publisher, there were many introductions that did not contain did not signal a move to. Okay. 3 of the introductions contained, in fact, only one single move. So BSP1 that she analyzed contained only a move 1, whereas BSP3 and 8 only contained a move 3, like we saw in the other example I showed you. None of them follow a strict move 1, move 2, move 3 sequence. The only sequence that is repeated is move 1, move 3, which occurs 4 times. Okay, so this is what in the table that she published in her article, you can see here that in these journals, BSP, Brazilian and English specific purposes, 1 through 10, the moves were just a 1 or a 1 and a 3, then a 1 to, so establishing a territory, and then occupying a niche that is never, although the niche is never ever actually mentioned. Here you have a 1 and a 3 and a 1 and a 2 and a 3. And so just as Liana Renault points out, what's missing in this one and 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 this one is a move 2. And it's a bit odd if you think about it, or not really odd, but you can see how it could cause a negative impression if you establish a territory and not talk about what niche you're addressing, what gap is being addressed, and just move into occupying the niche. Whereas the International Journal, the English Specific Purposes Journal, the ESP Journal, so a journal of the same type of papers being published, but by a non-Brazilian international publisher, you can see that there's only one instance in which move 2 doesn't occur in the introduction analyzed, which is ESPJ2. The rest of them, there not only is one 2, but there are several 2s happening, several gaps being pointed out. And you may recall Martin Hewing's research that I cited in the first module, when in the context of what is are non-native speakers prejudiced, and what Martin Hewings found, and is consistent with this research, was that a majority of reviewers commented that they could not identify the novelty or the contribution of those papers. There was not a clear novelty. Whereas here, it seems that the contribution is very, very clear, made very, very clear in the international journals that Liana Renault, introductions in the international journal Liana Renault analyzed. I should say that I'm not putting a judgment call on this. I'm not saying that the Brazilian journals are somehow inferior to the international journals that Eliana Irano analyzed, and she would say the same thing. But if you recall in Module 1, I talked about this kind of game that is played. There are certain kind of rules, these moves that John Swale pointed out, this CARS model, creating a research space model. This kind of model is a kind of game, a kind of publishing game, kind of rules that a lot of international publishers and reviewers and editors are familiar with. And I'm not saying that and neither is Eliana Renault, that the Brazilian authors somehow did something wrong, just that they didn't play by these particular, the rules of international publication. And I'm pointing these rules out because if you do include these, if you do meet these kind of expectations, these things that reviewers look for, it can have a positive effect on your publication success chances. And indeed, this is what happens in real life is, for example, these are the rating criteria that I see when I review for TESOL Quarterly. And the very first question that we're asked as reviewers to help us decide whether or not a paper is worth publishing or suitable for publication in this particular journal is that very first question. Does the manuscript contain new and significant information to justify publication? New. What is new about it? And similarly, along the same lines, is the problem significant and concisely stated? So this problem is in the context of the territory. This should be made clear in the territory, and I see these two things as linked. Is there new information? Is this problem that the author is addressing? Is this addressing something that is important and significant to the conversation that the author is entering into? And if these two questions, if a reviewer answers no, basically it's tantamount to a rejection. A reviewer really needs to answer yes to these two questions. And unfortunately, a lot of authors are not familiar with the importance of answering those two questions, being able to make the answer to those questions very crystal clear. And hopefully now, with an awareness of this CARS model, these three rhetorical moves, you will now write with those things in mind, and how those two questions are something that you should really be thinking of as you're planning your writing. Before you even sit down to write, have those questions, the answer to those questions clearly in mind.